4. Haggis Hunt. Outside, Uncle Hamish stood by a large open cart. "Come away, all!" and they all got into the cart. "Big John!" shouted Uncle Hamish. "I'll trouble you to break into a trot." The horse looked over his shoulder. "That'll be the day," he drawled. The cart moved slowly along the road through the snow. Florence in the front with Uncle Hamish, Brian, Dougal and Dylan in the middle, and Angus and Ermyntrude sitting on the picnic basket at the back, giggling a lot. They turned off the road through a gate marked "No Trespassers, No Campbells." "Why does it say no Campbells, Uncle Hamish?" asked Florence. "Because they are black-hearted, fierce and untrustworthy." "Oh," said Florence. They went along a lane through dark pines until they'd reached the end of the trees. "We start here, you'll come with me, lassie," Uncle Hamish said to Florence. "And you come with me, lassie," said Angus to Ermyntrude. "We'll go 3 ways and meet back here for lunch," said Uncle Hamish, and he set off with Florence at a brisk trot. Angus and Ermyntrude went another way, not quite so briskly, and Brian looked at Dougal again. "Have you even the remotest idea what to do?" he asked brightly. "No, I haven't." Big John looked over his nosebag. "You need to creep up and surround them. You can't miss them. They're round and fat and they go wee a lot." "I've gone off the whole idea," said Dougal. "But Uncle Hamish will expect me to catch one, I suppose." "Whee!" said Brian, going down a little hill. "Take cover!" screeched Dougal, going head first into a drift. Brian came back. "What are you doing in there?" "I heard one. It went whee!" "Oh, sorry, that was me." They went on. Suddenly, "Whee! Whee!" they heard. "Was that you?" whispered Dougal. "No," whispered Brian. Dougal went whiter than snow. "It's a haggis," he said faintly. "And it's coming this way," said Brian. "Whee! Whee! Whee!" A small round tartan object hurtled over their heads and landed in a flurry of snow a few feet away. The haggis looked at them with 2 piercing black eyes. "You're supposed to creep up and surround me. I heard you coming 2 miles away." "Well, we've never done it before," said Brian. "Sir, have we caught you?" "You have not, but you're welcome to try. Are you ready?" They said they were. "Away we go then," said the haggis, and it shot straight up in the air with a whee and disappeared like a bullet in the direction of Norway. Dougal sat down. "This is hopeless. It's about 100 miles away by now, and I'm cold." "Well, we don't want to be thought failures, though, do we?" said Brian. "Why not?" said Dougal. Brian climbed up a little hill and slid down again. "I got a marvellous idea. We'll make one." "We'll what?" "Make a haggis," said Brian, "and pretend we crept up on it and surrounded it and captured it. Get your coat off." "Only under protest," said Dougal with dignity, and he took his coat off and gave it to Brian. Brian spread it on the ground and pushed snow into it. It looked just like a haggis except for the eyes. What about the eyes? Brian burrowed into the snow until he cleared a little patch. "We'll use mud," he said. "Sit down here." "Why?" said Dougal. "The ground's frozen. We'll have to warm it." Dougal sat down. The things I do. Meanwhile, back at the cart, the others had returned from the haggis hunt empty-handed. "We didn't catch many, did we?" said Florence brightly. "Nay," said Uncle Hamish gloomily. "Do you usually catch a lot?" "Nay." There was a shout. Dougal and Brian appeared on the brow of the hill holding something up. "Oh, I think they've caught one," breathed Florence. "How exciting!" "Aye," said Uncle Hamish, not appearing to be too pleased. Dougal and Brian arrived breathless. Uncle Hamish inspected the haggis Brian and Dougal had brought. "Aye," he said, "a good specimen. We'll hang it in the hall over the great fire. Aye." Dougal went pale and choked on a sandwich. over the great fire, said Brian. Uncle Hamish, said Dougal, shouldn't we just let it go, perhaps? Let it go, shouted Uncle Hamish. My first haggis. We caught it, squeaked Brian. On my land and on the wall over the fire it shall go. They packed up the picnic and all got into the cart, Uncle Hamish putting the haggis under his seat. Dougal and Brian sat nervously together while the cart jolted along. Oh, fine mess you've got me into, muttered Dougal. I did my best, murmured Brian. They jogged on. Suddenly Brian nudged Dougal. Look, he whispered. A trickle of water was running along the bottom of the cart. It was the haggis melting rapidly. A ball of squashy snow tumbled slowly off the back. Dougal put his wet coat back on and waited apprehensively as they jogged along. When they got back, it was getting dark. Uncle Hamish got down and reached under the seat. He fumbled and felt. "Ah, it's gone," he thundered. "Ah, well, they're cunning wee beasties. Come, we'll have some tea." "I see you got your coat back, Dougal," whispered Florence significantly. "Don't be rotten," said Dougal, and they all went in to tea. Tobogganing. At breakfast next morning, no mention was made of the haggis hunt. Instead, Uncle Hamish suggested they might like to amuse themselves as he was going to be busy. "If we had any sense, we could think of something," said Brian. "All right, clever breeks," said Dougal. "You think of something." "I have," said Brian. They waited. Brian buttered a piece of toast. "Well, tell us then," said Dougal furiously. "Plead with me," said Brian. "Perhaps if you could tell us, Brian," said Florence. "Tin trays." "Tin trays," said Dougal. "Tin trays," said Brian. "They make good toboggans." "Brian, you are clever," said Florence. "Anyone could have thought of that," said Dougal. "Then why didn't you?" "My mind was on higher things." "We'll go on a search," said Florence, "and meet in the hall in 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, in the hall, they were all assembled again. Brian had a tin tray marked Primrose Tea Rooms, scones for a penny. Dougal also had a tray. It was long and thin and covered with a picture of Skermely in autumn. Florence had found a large biscuit tin just big enough to sit in, and Dylan had the lid. Ermyntrude came in with a tin lid about 10 centimetres across. "I don't think it will hold me," she said sadly. "I don't think a barren door would hold you," giggled Dougal. Outside, Big John was leaning against the wall. "Hello, Big John," said Florence. "Hi," said Big John. "Going someplace?" "Tobogganing." "I reckon Ben Bumpy would be the best." "What's Ben Bumpy?" said Florence. "A mountain, about half a mile as a crow flies. Course, if I had a mind, I could take you." "We'd be grateful for a lift, Big John," said Florence. "Hitch up then," said Big John, and as he moved away from the wall, they saw he had attached to his harness a long rope. "An animated ski lift," said Dougal. "Now I've seen everything." They sat on their various trays, stood on their various skis, caught hold of the rope, and Big John started off, pulling them along like a giant tail straight up Ben Bumpy. They stood at the top and looked down. Brian sat on his tray. "I provided the notion, and I think someone else should provide the first run." "You're absolutely right, Mollusk," said Dougal, and he gave Brian a little push. "Help!" said Brian. "Quite a good ton of speed," said Dougal, and he laughed so much he sat down heavily on his tray. "Help!" "I don't think he meant to do that," said Ermyntrude, watching Dougal disappear. Halfway down the slope, Dougal was catching up with Brian very rapidly. Brian was enjoying himself. "Whee!" he shouted. "Whee!" Dougal slid swiftly on. "Get out of the way!" he screeched. "Steer round me!" shouted Brian. "I can't!" screamed Dougal. Dougal got closer and closer. There was a sharp clang. "Welcome aboard," said Brian. Ahead of them, a large mound of snow loomed up. "We'll go over it," shouted Brian happily. They didn't go over it. They went into it. "Do you think they're all right?" said Florence anxiously as she got on her biscuit tin. "No one else coming?" "Goodbye," they said, giving her a little push. Meanwhile, Dougal and Brian were in an icy cavern, and there was a dark tunnel leading out of it. A long black and white nose appeared, followed by a black and white head and a black and white body. It was a badger. "I see you have a tray with you. Whilst this is not actually a cafeteria, I could provide a cup of tea if you wish." He disappeared down the tunnel. "We've got a right one here," whispered Dougal, and he sat down very suddenly with a shriek as a biscuit tin hit him in the back. "Hello," said Florence. "I was looking for you." Meanwhile, back on the hill, the others had watched Florence's progress with interest. "The girls disappeared too," said Ermyntrude. "I think there's cause for a search party." So on 2 skis and a biscuit tin, they set out bravely. Meanwhile, back in the Badger's hallway, Florence and Brian and Dougal were drinking tea. There was a flurry of snow, and Ermyntrude's head appeared. "I'll just get another cup," said the Badger, and he went. In quick succession, Mr. Rusty, Mr. McHenry, and Dillon arrived in the icy hall. The Badger came back. "I hope we're not intruding," said Mr. Rusty. "Intruding," said the Badger. Intrusion. To enter uninvited, to thrust oneself in forcibly and unwelcome. I suppose, strictly speaking, you have forced yourself in, but as you are welcome, you are not intruding. I hope you will come again." "Thank you," said Florence. "I think we should go now." "Thank you for the tea," they said. Outside, Big John was waiting. "Hello, Big John," said the Badger. "Leg better?" "Depends on what you mean by better."
"Well, in the sense that it's not as bad as it was before."
"In that case, yes," said Big John.
"Good," said the Badger. "Go safely."
"Goodbye, Mr. Campbell," said Big John, and they all went home. Golf. One day, Brian and Dougal were looking around in Uncle Hamish's loft. "Hey, look, what's this?" "That's a golf bag," said Dougal thoughtfully. The bag had lots of little labels hanging from the handle. They read them. Hamish MacDougall, Troon, 1923. Hamish MacDougall, Carnoustie, 1931. Hamish MacDougall, Open Champion St. Andrews. Uncle Hamish was in the hall when they went down with the golf clubs. "Why didn't you tell us you were Open Champion?" said Dougal. "I wasn't asked," said Uncle Hamish. "Will you have a game?" squeaked Brian. Uncle Hamish looked the golf clubs over. "Oh, it's been a long time." "Angus!" Angus appeared. "Put out my +4s and my spiky shoes. We're off to the links." Angus roared with laughter. "I gave your +4s to the Women's Rural Jumble Sale 20 years ago, and your spiky shoes to Oxfam." "Yet no right," screeched Uncle Hamish. So Uncle Hamish put on his brogues and they set off for the golf course. "Go into that shop, say I sent you, and ask Willie McNuckle for some clubs to use." Dougal and Brian did so. Mr. McNuckle," said Dougal. "Aye," said Mr. McNuckle. He was a little man with a huge red beard. We want to borrow some clubs," said Dougal. "Uncle Hamish said you'd lend us some." Willie produced a set of clubs. Dougal picked them up and nearly fell over. They're a bit heavy. So Willie put the clubs on a little trolley, and Dougal and Brian joined Uncle Hamish on the first tee. "Driver," he said to Angus. "Driver?" whispered Brian. "Where's he going?" "It's a golf club," hissed Dougal. Uncle Hamish put a ball on a little peg, then hit the ball with a great crack and strode away after it. "Spoon!" said Uncle Hamish. "Spoon?" said Angus. "Are you mad? Take the cleek." "Will you give me the spoon and stop blethering?" screamed Uncle Hamish. "Good game, isn't it?" said Brian brightly. They caught up. Angus was holding the flag, and Uncle Hamish was looking intently at his ball, which was lying very close to a little hole. Uncle Hamish," said Dougal. "Wheat," said Uncle Hamish. "I've a birdie here." "I think it's golfing talk," hissed Dougal. Uncle Hamish finally made up his mind, and with a great indrawing of breath, tapped the ball into the hole. "Lucky," muttered Angus. They walked off to another patch of grass. "Will you give me my niblick?" said Uncle Hamish. Angus silently gave him a club. Uncle Hamish swished the ball again, gave a look towards the flag, and hit the ball another great click. It sped up very high and came down again on the green. "You'd have done better with your mashy niblick," said Angus. "Do you think we should go home?" said Brian. But Dougal was determined. "Give me a club," he said. "Do you want a spoon or a cleek or a mashy or a baffy?" "Oh, just give me one." Brian rummaged. "There's a nice wooden one here." "That'll do," said Dougal, taking the club and walking to the tee. Dougal took a swish or two, looked hard at the ball, and aimed a mighty blow at it. The ball shot straight up into the air. "Oh dear," said Brian. The ball came down, 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 landed on the green, hit Uncle Hamish's ball, and dropped into the hole. They walked slowly up to the green, where Uncle Hamish and Angus were waiting. "Sorry," said Dougal. "You should be," said Uncle Hamish. "Well, we'll see how you fare on the next. A long hole, this." "Where is the hole?" said Dougal. Uncle Hamish pointed. Away in the distance, just visible, fluttered a little flag. "Is there a bus?" said Brian. "Driver," said Uncle Hamish, and Angus gave him a club. Dougal stepped up to the tee. "Driver," he said, and Brian handed him a club. "That'll do," said Dougal nonchalantly. They set off towards where the two balls were lying. Dougal turned to Brian. "Spoon." "Spoon?" said Brian. "That's never a spoon shot. Take your mashy tatty." Dougal aimed and swung. The ball stayed where it was, but the club went sideways like a bullet, hit a tree with a sharp crack, shot backwards towards Dougal, and landed at his feet. He laughed nervously. "Just practicing," he said. Dougal hit the ball quickly. It went along the ground like a rabbit and ended up just beside Uncle Hamish's. Uncle Hamish gave his ball a little hit, and it rolled up very close to the hole and stopped. He went over and tapped it in. You need to put the ball in the hole in one more stroke and you win," said Uncle Hamish. Dougal went up to the ball and hit it. It went sideways, hit Angus on a horn, bounced on Brian's shell, and into the hole. "Come, Angus," said Uncle Hamish slowly. "We'll away." When they got back, Florence was pouring tea. "May I have a spoon?" said Dougal, screeching with laughter. "Try a niblick," said Brian, shrieking. Uncle Hamish came in. They stopped laughing very quickly. "And what have you been doing, Uncle Hamish?" said Florence. "I'd rather not talk about it," he said, "in the present company." Highland Games. "Don't you think we've been here rather a long time?" said Florence one day when they were all out for a walk. everyone agreed that perhaps they should think of going back soon. They told Uncle Hamish when they got back for lunch. "Ah, we'll," he said. "Aye, aye, we'll." Then he got up and left without saying any more.
"We must get him a present," said Florence thoughtfully.
"But what?" said Mr. Rusty. They thought. Everything went quiet for a very long time. "You know what I think?" said Brian suddenly. "Yes, we do," said Dougal. "I think he'd like us to feel that we appreciated Scotland, so I think we should give him a Highland Games." He looked round brightly. "Do you know," said Dougal, "I think you may finally have an idea." So it was decided, and of course it was kept a secret from Uncle Hamish. "Just one little thing," said Mr. Rusty. "Yes," they said. What are Highland Games?" Angus was asked. The games you're planning." "Yes, the games," they said. I can wheel the games." "Perhaps you'll be kind enough to explain them to us," they said. "Well, they toss the caber," said Angus, "and they pitch the hammer, and they bend the bawbee, and they slither the shovel, and they call the yows to the nows sometimes, if they have a mind." He paused reflectively. "I was good at that." "I shall dance my Highland fling," said Florence, "if I can learn it." Mr. McHenry said he would provide floral tributes and decorations, and Mr. Rusty said he would announce the events. The next few days were spent preparing. Dougal asked Big John to provide him with a caber, and Big John said he couldn't get one before the day of the games. "Don't worry," said Dougal loftily. "I don't need practice." The day of the games arrived. After breakfast, Uncle Hamish was led out to the chosen field and seated in a special chair. Dylan came out and proceeded to open the games by playing so powerfully on the bagpipes that Uncle Hamish was seen to wilt. Florence was next. Mr. Rusty laid down boards, Dylan played the pipes, and Florence gave Uncle Hamish her Highland fling. At the end, Uncle Hamish roared to Florence that it was well done, and would she come and sit by him? Florence did so. "What's next?" said Uncle Hamish, and Mr. Rusty announced Ermyntrude. "Sword dance," whispered Florence. "Oh, aye," whispered Uncle Hamish. Ermyntrude hadn't been able to find any swords, so she laid a toasting fork and an old golf club on the dancing board Florence had used, and she performed her sword dance to great acclaim, especially from Angus. Mr. Rusty announced Dougal. "Caber tossing," whispered Florence. "Oh, aye," whispered Uncle Hamish. Dougal stepped into the middle of the arena. Big John," he called, "I'll trouble you for the caber." Big John ambled on, pulling after him a tree trunk of prodigious length and girth. Dougal paled. "I must be mad," he groaned, and he got his shoulders under the caber and started to heave. "Careful, Dougal," said Florence. "Now she tells me," gritted Dougal, doing little runs backwards and forwards with the caber pointing straight up. The caber tilted. Everyone gasped. The caber tilted more, and Dougal set off at a run down the field. "Throw it!" they shouted. "I can't!" screeched Dougal. He was gathering more speed and finally disappeared through a hole in the wall at the end of the field. There was a faint crash from the distance, and with a loud squawk, Dougal flew back over into the field and landed in the middle with a bump. "Are you all right, Dougal?" called Florence anxiously. Dougal got up and put his kilt straight. "I have just run 14 miles holding a tree. I have hit a rock and been flung back like a daub of mud into the middle of the field. Of course I am not all right." "Time for Brian's surprise," they all shouted. Mr. Rusty called for silence. Brian went to the middle of the field, bowed right, left and centre, and let out a piercing whistle. There was a rushing of wings, and hundreds of pigeons flew low over the field, circled and went high into the sky. The air filled with the sound of 1,000 pipers, and with a ping and a bong, a table appeared covered with a huge tea with a vast cake in the shape of a letter H. "Brian," breathed Florence, "what a surprise! How did you do it?" Brian smiled modestly. "I had a little help," he said, and there was Zebedee bogging around the middle of the field, laughing like anything. The next morning, after they had all packed and had a last look round, the train was found fast asleep in a siding, and everyone loaded in. Florence looked at the hills and the trees. "It's time to go," she said sadly. "I may cry," said Brian. "Don't be so soft," said Dougal, sniffing. Uncle Hamish blew up his bagpipes and started to play a long, sad tune. "I shall cry," said Brian. "Got a hanky?" said Dougal. It was time to go. So they went.